Hey guys, and welcome to Mastering Lighting Lesson 3. As you know, I always try and be honest with myself, and for a while there I let things get away from me. And for the first time since creating the course, we received some pretty bad feedback due to the delays. What made it worse was I couldn't really blame anyone but myself for that. However, every time I've had these moments in my life, I've pulled myself out by working harder. I'd never allow myself to take advantage of those who are helping me achieve my dream. So for those who felt let down by me or the course, I'm truly sorry, which, at the end of the day doesn't mean much unless I back it up. So I really needed this to be a huge lesson to gain a bit of that trust back that I owed you and myself. So in this lesson, and it's quite an enormous one, it's about 4 hours of content, we're going to be working on the Ironman MK7 bust, and there's a lot of detail to go over, as it's a fairly large step up from lesson 2 in terms of the workflow and detail required. Now, because of the way I've laid things out in Mastering V-Ray, you should have a pretty good understanding of the shading and texturing in scene, leaving me more time to focus on the lighting and post-production workflow. For those on the hard surface course, you'll also have been following along with the modeling side of things, and I've recently had a massive boost in motivation in that area. Now, aside from breaking my hand again last week, I've had a successful live stream that's going to be followed up with another longer one very soon, where I'm going to be focusing on finishing off the modeling on this MK7 bust. That's going to be available to everyone live, and for those who've subscribed, you'll also have permanent access later on via the website in case you miss it. So just to clarify there, everyone on this lighting course is going to have access to those 3 or 4 hard surface lessons, because my ultimate goal in creating all 3 of these courses, and now the retouching course with Milton, is to really encompass that entire CGI for print workflow. Now, you've also waited a fair bit, so I feel like it's only fair to give you guys more content. But for now, I think it's a great time to get started on the lesson. I spent a huge amount of work trying to make this the most detailed one yet, so I hope you appreciate it. But at the end of the day, we've still got a lot to do to catch up on, and there's a lot more detailed content to cover on this course. Thanks guys for waiting, and like I've said, I hope you like the lesson. Now, there's a lot to get through in this lesson, but I'm really excited to start showing you how I approach complete scenes from start to finish, because there's a lot of subtle creative choices made on projects like this that Mastering V-Ray simply couldn't cover. And even though Mastering V-Ray had a lot of technical knowledge in it, I'm actually very against being restrained by what is scientifically accurate, and tend to go with whatever works or helps make the image actually look better, while using the knowledge I taught in that course as a consistent starting point. So even though I gave you a good understanding of shader creation and stuck with a fairly consistent workflow, sometimes you have to break away from that, especially now that the projects I'll be teaching have to factor in the retoucher involved at the end of the pipeline. So near the end of the lesson, I'll break down the additional work that can be done to really give an image the final touches a professional project deserves. Now basically, when I first started in the industry, I used to try and do everything in the beauty pass and hand that off to the retouchers to work with. But that workflow is very limited, so as I became more confident in understanding what they were capable of in post, I started to build my own comp files for them to work with. In a way, I'm trying to think of things from the retoucher's point of view. So what could be useful for them to actually enhance the image? And now that doesn't have to be in the beauty pass. You can think outside the box to give them things that make their life easier. Now, the most basic things they will require are alphas for all the important pieces on the project, ambient occlusion passes. Now, you can make small scale ambient occlusion passes, large ones, and they can blend where they want those to kind of multiply in. We can give them some additional reflection passes, but there's also a few other things we're capable of giving them that can help them out at the end of the process. But please remember, if you haven't worked one-on-one with a retoucher before, you have to familiarize yourself with their own specific workflow, because sometimes they can be overwhelmed with what you're giving them. And because this is the first time I'm really creating a project with the retoucher in mind, I'm going to try and cover all the bases and show you what's possible or what type of things I would actually pass off to them. So like I was saying, if you do that and you don't really explain to them kind of what you're trying to achieve, they can be overwhelmed with what you're giving them and not know what to do with it. My personal preference is to get the renders to a point where you discuss with them what they're potentially going to do in post. If you've done a good enough job, usually the response will be something like, "Not much, it looks good to me." But don't listen to them. They're probably just being modest. Now, retouchers, they really know their stuff when it comes to analyzing an image and how to actually enhance it. And that's because their job is a lot less complex than ours, and therefore they're able to fill that kind of void with more creativity. So a good retoucher will always be able to see past your own vision and do things that you're not personally capable of doing anyway. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself right now, and before we can even consider what passes to hand off to the retoucher, we've got to go all the way back to the start of the project, because even though the focus on this course is going to be on the lighting side of things, it's extremely important for me to break down all the little subtle things I'm factoring in when creating a project, because they all contribute to the final result. Now, the very first step in that pipeline is making sure the model is as good as possible. The last thing you want to have to do is fix errors or re-render things later on after you've done all that work because you made a small modeling mistake. So I'm going to run you through how I've modeled this just very quickly, and remember, I've actually covered how to create this whole Iron Man MK7 bust in the Mastering Hard Surface course itself. Now, what I explained to the guys on that course is that it's very important to make sure that your edges aren't too hard. Now, one of the biggest problems is, and I actually feel in the print industry, they still kind of haven't figured this out yet, is that you need to make sure that your edges on your geometry are actually softer than you might realize. So for example, I've seen, especially in the Iron Man movies, the way they're modeled, everything's kind of razor sharp, and it makes things so much harder for the render engine to pick up highlights. Now, it's not like real life where even just a small edge is going to get picked up and create like a nice blooming highlight. So what I do when I model is I try and keep everything as low res as possible. So you'll see on the model here, everything's created using edge extrusion, and I explain the whole process throughout the Mastering Hard Surface course in the last 3 lessons, and I'm going to be doing a live stream to show you how I finished off that character, because where I left off on the last Hard Surface lesson, I'd only just finished blocking this stuff out. So everything I'm explaining now about trying to keep the edges soft, I'll explain in a free live stream. And remember, because I'm trying to tie in, and this was my original goal when I first started mastering V-Ray, it was to try and keep some of the subject material across the 4 courses consistent so that you could get a feel for that entire workflow. So basically what I mean is, if we go back to mastering V-Ray, you'll remember in the advanced material lesson, I showed you how to create the Iron Man material based on the reference I was looking at. Now I'm going to go quickly through the materials in this scene just so you've got a rough understanding of where I went with that, but at the end of the day, I'm using the same workflow to match the reference photography that we've got here. On top of that, in the Mastering Hard Surface course, obviously I've gone from shading to modeling the character. In this lesson, we're going to be lighting the character, and then Milton's going to be taking all the render passes I've created from this project, and that's going to be the start of the Mastering Retouching course. So once you've got your model locked off and you're happy with everything in that respect, the very next thing you need to make sure is locked off is the camera. Now, in the print industry, you'll very quickly realize how important that is, because any subtle changes to the camera angle can drastically alter or even destroy the very specific lighting you've set up from that specific angle. So it's really important to make sure that you and your client are aware of that, especially because they've got a tendency very late in the game of going in and making those changes. So if the client isn't aware of how important locking the camera off is, you can kind of run into those massive issues. Now, because this is a very complicated scene in terms of the lighting and post-production workflow, I've kept things fairly simple, but there's a couple of important things to look out for when you start a project. The first thing you want to make sure you've got right is you've got some bleed room in the scene. You don't want the model kind of being rendered here so that when you have some post effects put on in the V-Ray frame buffer, like the bloom and glare, it gets clipped. So that's why I've got a slight area of bleed room. Now, to figure out the type of camera I wanted to use in this scene, I'm just going to resort to my very basic settings of kind of sticking to the Hasselblad. So if I go into the scene and I select the V-Ray camera, you'll see I've got a 35mm film gate, and I keep that fairly standard. Now the next thing I go a little bit long on the focal length. I don't want to go so long where the character ends up appearing very flat, and if I go to say 100 mils here, you'll see what happens. If I zoom out back to roughly where I was, it looks a little bit squashed, or at least in my opinion. You also don't want to go too flat or too short, because if I go down to 30mm and zoom in, now you can see it kind of looks like the bottom of the character is pinching out towards the front of the image, and it's a very rookie mistake to make. So I've kind of got a nice middle ground set up here with a 60mm focal length. Now, to figure out how I rotated the character or to get the angle, what I've done is I've gone in and stolen an image from Sideshow Toys and just kind of cropped it out and dragged it into an image with the same image aspect. So if you scale down the render from 7216 by 5412 down to a more reasonable size like 1920 by 1440, that's how I've managed to get things lined up in Photoshop. So you can see here it's 1920 by 1440. I've got the image and I've centered it to the image here, and what I've done is I've saved this off as a background for the viewport. So I'll just call this BG. Doesn't matter what type of settings. Now I'll go in from the camera view, hit Alt B to load up the viewport configuration, and now I can load the texture I've just saved, and that's going to appear in the background. Now, I've just wanted to make sure that things are kind of roughly lined up here. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it definitely helps with how you're positioning things. So because in the Photoshop file, I've scaled this down maybe a little bit too small, because I think I was factoring in the fact that it had the reflections from the stand that I don't actually have in the scene. I've ended up going a little bit further forward. But if you can see, if I zoom out here and kind of roughly pull things, this is how I figured out what angle to use. Once you're happy with that, I can just simply remove that and get on to the next part, which will be figuring out how I'm going to light this guy and shade this guy. So you've got your model locked off, you've got your camera locked off, now you need to move on to shading the character and making sure in that respect that things are at the very least realistic. So at this point in the project, I'm not trying to focus on making things look good. And this is why I've got two different reference images up on my screen. You can see on the left here, the reference image I've got up is straight from Sideshow Toys, and it's been professionally shot. Now, even though for me personally and in the print industry, the lighting here simply isn't good enough to use on a game art cover or something like that, because even though it might look nice on the helmet, there's so many little details being missed out on the character here that could be greatly improved with better position lighting. Now obviously they're just trying to sell a toy, you know, they're not trying to sell a movie, so there's a bit less money involved, and they might not have the means to have every single image from every angle professionally retouched and all the time to just go in and make sure from every angle the lighting's perfect. But one thing having these two images side by side does point out is that with different lighting, the materials on the same exact asset can look completely different. So on the left here, we've got much stronger lighting, and therefore what's happening is we're bringing out more of the diffuse on the shader Also, I'm not really sure, and you've got to be very careful when you're looking at more professional images, how retouched they've actually been. And I don't mean professionally retouched, I just mean in general. So do we know, for example, if the saturation has been improved on this image, the contrast has been improved or kind of boosted? At the end of the day, you really don't know. So that's why I've got the reference on the right here, because it's a lot more realistic and it's a lot more easy to kind of perceive how the shader is set up. So I know from experience, if I can get the shaders looking similar to how I've got things viewed on the right here, it's going to be much easier later on to go in and try and light the character and get things matching on the left here. Because if I kind of count out this reference on the right and all I'm using as reference throughout the entire project is the professionally shot reference images, it's very easy to get a skewed and warped opinion on how things were set up. And even with all that said, it's still very difficult and sometimes, near impossible to match things just because of how different the asset can look from reference image to reference image. Now, really the only way to get around that is just to do a lot of trial and error. What I like to do is I'll go in and I'll just zoom in on this right image here, and very similar to the advanced material creation mastering V-Ray, I'm just trying to figure out what is actually going into creating this shader. So at the very base, you can see it is slightly metallic, and there is two different layers here. So you've got the very blurry top coat, and you can see it is quite blurry because there's just a lot of subtle bumps in the surface that are creating that, it doesn't have the mirror coat that the film versions of the shaders have. Now, for me personally, it's just going to come down to personal preference, because I personally feel that this red material seems a lot more realistic than the really shiny metal seen in the films. So I'm just going to pause the recording here and kind of give you an example of the two. Now you can see quickly on the left here that I've got a screenshot from the film up, and overall the highlights are a lot less blurry and the detail on the mesh is a lot cleaner. So even though, try and disregard the fact that the mesh itself is damaged, all the lines and everything are much more perfect. The gaps between different parts are perfect. Now, this is just my opinion. I feel that really helps degrade the overall quality of the realism, because it just doesn't feel as solid and, handmade as a real life prop does. So on the right here, you can see the gaps between objects. There's spacing issues. You've got parts that are overlapping. Now, for me personally, the expensive and detailed look of the model comes from the actual design of the paneling itself. I feel when you've got stuff that's so perfect, it can take away from that. So that's why for this particular project, I'm not trying to match what was done in the film. I'm trying to match something straight from real life, which ultimately is a little bit more challenging, but at the end of the day, it's a lot more rewarding because you're showcasing your eye for detail on really high-res projects. So all the little scuffing in the dark crevice areas, the subtle wobbling on the surface, really gets to kind of be highlighted on a project like this. So on this particular project, for now anyway, I'm going to completely disregard the reference on the left here because I'm not sure exactly how this was shot or lit or how strong the lighting actually is, and I'm going to rely more on something that's a little bit more realistic and more of a fan-made reference image of the actual item we're trying to light. So I'm going to drag this over to the right side of my screen, and I'm going to have that up at all times while I'm working on this project. Now the reason for that is because as you work on a project, you'll pick up all the little subtle details, day by day. You'll notice things that you didn't the day before, and it's extremely important to have that reference image up at all times. I really can't stress this enough because it seems like whenever I've worked one-on-one with other artists and asked them to do that stuff, it's kind of like, yeah, I agree, but then you look over the next day and they don't have any reference up. And it might sound like I'm repeating myself, but I really can't stress. You really need to do your best to get a couple of extra screens, maybe just one screen at the bare minimum, so that while you're lighting something on the main monitor, you've got all your reference up on the others. But before I can even start creating shaders, what I've got to do is I've got to kind of figure out a quick way to match the lighting in this scene. Now this is where having your own HDRI library is really beneficial. And you'll notice on the Facebook page recently, I was mentioning that all the Jorgen HDRs are going to be up on our site very soon. So we've actually done all the back-end work for that. We're just currently doing a couple of little tweaks here and there, but we are going to be providing that library so that you kind of have the same ability that I have when I'm trying to select HDRIs at the start of a project. So I'm going to drag this image off to the left, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to select the V-Ray HDRI I've got loaded into this startup scene. And you can see here, I don't really need to re-explain myself how I've done this because it's very similar to what was explained in the V-Ray course. But I'm just going to go in, and you can see here I've got all of Jorgen's interior HDRIs up because I know the reference image was shot in an interior. So I'm just going to go in basically now and just start loading in a couple of HDRs to see how close I can get things. Now, rather than using Octane, like I said in the introduction to this lesson, we're going to be relying on V-Ray RT throughout this project. Now, we're not going to be using V-Ray RT for anything other than some basic shader tweaks, and then as we get into the finer details on the project, I'll swap to the production renderer doing region renders, because at that point, I really need to know straight away how it's going to look when I send it off to the retoucher. Now, because we're using V-Ray RT and not Octane, the lesson's gone in a slightly different direction. I'm a lot more experienced working with Octane, and I feel I can get more kind of production ready results straight out of the renderer. But there are quite a few limitations with Octane that V-Ray RT doesn't have, and vice versa. So I'm not going to use V-Ray RT for the final production render like I would in Octane, but for all the lighting and basic material setup, we'll be relying on V-Ray RT. So to set V-Ray RT up, and I know I'm probably covering very basic stuff here, but for those who haven't used it, in the common tab of in your render dialog box, if I go down to the assign renderer and go to active shade, I've loaded V-Ray RT there, which loads up its own individual settings. Most of these settings you don't need to tweak. I'll get into these as I get a bit more experienced throughout the course. I mean, I've done the research already, but I don't feel 100% confident in asking you to do things at this point, especially on the first project. So if you're going to be following along like I am, just keep things at their default, and remember that if you're going to change anything, it'd probably be the trace depth. Octane by default has a trace depth of 10, but you will notice differences if you go all the way up to 20. And all the trace depth means is it's just the number of times the reflections bounce. GI depth of 3 is perfectly fine. Like I said, we're not trying to do a production ready job here. We're just trying to have real-time feedback as I adjust materials and the HDRs loaded in. So I've got the HDR loaded up here. All I'm going to do now is go to the camera view, hit active shade. It's important to realize too, I've got the image aspect the same in V-Ray RT, which changes by default if you haven't set that up. So make sure you set your output size the same. And you can see here, it's just very quickly rendering. I can go into the V-Ray HDRI and start rotating this to get a feel for if the HDRI is actually matching our reference. So let me just drag my reference back into Photoshop here. The reference I've got up here is kind of lit by a few very small spotlights and maybe one larger light. You can see up here we've got the large light, then a few little ones. What I've got going here is a little bit similar, but I feel it's just a little bit too overlit. So this is where I'll go in and just start experimenting with a couple of different HDRs. Now things are still a little bit off, but I feel like they're a bit closer. So what I'll do is I'll just start rotating hopefully, getting things matching a bit closer. All the meanwhile, remember, even though I'm swapping for the lessons purpose back to Photoshop, I've got the reference up on the other screen as I'm kind of making those adjustments. I'm going to go into the material now, and I'm going to make the material less glossy. And if I'm not really happy with how the HDR is working, like I said, I'll just go in and select another one. So this HDR's got a little bit too much outdoor light happening, and it doesn't feel as indoor as the reference I've got here, which is being lit purely by, artificial light. Once again, a little bit too much outdoor light. So looking at this, I'm kind of trying to make a couple of decisions here because it's going to have a fairly big impact on how I perceive the shaders are looking. So I'm just kind of taking a look at if there's enough light sources here, whereabouts they're hitting. I'm going to go quickly kind of remember which ones are working better than others. So I've got white flat here, which for testing purposes is going to be, what I feel closest so far, but then I'm just going to quickly go back because once you start, swapping between HDRs, you can quickly forget how others were set up. So I'm going to go back to the Oceania one here. And I'm going to drop down the multiplier and see if that kind of helps with the intensity of the light. And now I feel like this could be a better example HDR to start creating some very simple shaders. The next thing I need to factor in is the actual gamma of the HDR. Now the higher I go on the gamma in the V-Ray HDRI, the less contrast there is in the HDR, and therefore things flatten out and the overall intensity of the HDR is dropped. The lower I go, the inverse applies and we get a much more brighter hotspot on the image and darker shadowy areas. So because I dropped the intensity down, things are blowing out a little bit too much and we're losing a bit of the detail in the HDR. So what I'm going to do from here is raise the gamma up a bit. Now you can see I'm gaining a little bit more of the information in the shadow areas, and the highlights are still strong enough to create a nice bloomy effect over the surface. Now at the moment things are completely grayscale in the shader. I don't have any diffuse whatsoever in this shader. So I need to go back to the reference and I'm going to go to full 100% on the reference image. Thankfully this is very high res and I can see all the features of the shader that I need to incorporate in V-Ray. The first thing obviously, and like I taught you in Mastering V-Ray, is going to the very base and trying to break down how many layers are in a shader. Now you can see here that, and it might be difficult to the untrained eye, but I can see this shade is built into two layers. We've got a metallic base coat, which is where the red's coming from, and then we've got the clear top coat. Both are very blurry. It's even at glancing angles here at the back, you can see that things are quite blurry, unlike the helmet where on the edge we're getting some more crispy reflections. Also at the base of this material I can see that there's a very subtle metallic-y red reflection happening, and because the top coat's spread over that, it's kind of masking that metallic effect. But if I go into the reference image on the left here where there's much stronger lighting, you can see where the tail of the highlight fades off, we get nice strong red pingy reflections, for example in here. So I know that the base material has to be red, and I know it has to have some kind of diffuse in it because we're also picking up very obvious shadows on the surface. So I can just go in here with a simple, color and start trying to apply a red. But what I noticed is when I started comparing V-Ray to Octane, I lost a little bit of control using the basic color picker. So what I like to do from now on is every time I'm going to load a color, I'm going to go in and I'm going to just make this a V-Ray color. So once I load that in, now I've got much finer control to to 3 decimal points of all the red, green and blue kind of affecting that color. So if something's a little bit too red, I can go down here and rather than going back 1 on the saturation, and you can see I make a few changes here, and it only starts affecting the 3rd decimal point after I've made some quite heavy changes. So that's where it's good to be able to go in and actually just kind of slide here to affect the color. So when it came to creating the materials for this scene, I really don't want to have to repeat myself from the Mastering V-Ray lesson. So what I've done is, to make things a little bit easier to read, is I've gone in and made 2 versions of the red and gold shader for this particular scene. Down the bottom in this file that I'm going to save for you guys, I'm going to call it something like material tests. There's going to be a simple version of each, and as you can see, the red and gold only have 2 layers. They've got the base layer and the clear coat layer. So like the reference shows, there's just the red metallic layer at the bottom and then the blurry top coat, and the exact same goes for the gold, except the gold's top coat is a little bit less blurry, except it's also a bit less reflective. So if you want to go through and try and understand the shaders, first take a look at the simple versions, and then you'll be able to see in the more complex versions that I've gone in and created a few different layers to enhance things. And if you look at this render I've set up here, I know it's not the greatest quality render, but you can see the difference. Here's the before and here's the after. So in the shader I've gone in and started to occlude some of the reflection, and I've started to blend in duller, more blurry parts in the dirt layers. So if I'm going to go in and explain how I did that stuff, in the dust coat for example, I've got 3 different layers in a composite map. The first is just a general dust scatter layer. Then on top of that, I've got a thumbprint layer, which you're used to, and I'm just simply blending that together at 50%. And then at the very top, I've got a V-Ray dirt map. And now inside the V-Ray dirt map, there's a radius mapped once again to a composite texture. And all this does is it simply makes the dirt not be spread in a linear way, so it kind of looks more messy. If there's enough of a request for this type of information to be taught, I can go over it, but the shaders are so similar to what was in the previous lesson, I don't really feel like it's extremely necessary. But there was a couple of things to take note of. One of those was that on the black wash layer, if you want to enhance the amount of dirt visible, or if you're not happy with just a raw V-Ray dirt being strong enough, what you can do is you can plug the V-Ray dirt into an output map and then increase that. So for this lesson, on the parts where I want to, and I'll just quickly zoom in here, you can see how in the crevices it goes quite dark. Now at its default, it wasn't enough just with a value of 1, so I had to go up to 3. So this dirt is 3 times as powerful. Now I used that at various points in the shader. I did the same thing. It's basically just the exact same 2 shaders in the dark and the black wash from the red to the gold, except the red is a little bit less reflective, so you can see more of the dust coat. So in the back of the shader, you'll see this dust layer that I've got loaded in. And after I did this test render, I actually went in and did some touch-ups to that, because you can see there's areas where the UV mapping is being clipped. But overall, they're fairly complex shaders, but at the end of the day, the job is going to look nearly identical with or without those extra details. So I didn't feel like there was any need to go in and make the lesson 4.5 hours long just to include the shader knowledge, when I've got them simply laid out for you here. So we're going to get on to lighting this guy, which is going to be the main topic of this lesson, where I'm going to try and teach you all the little details that go into a project in a professional environment. So we're going to take it a little bit further than what I worked on in the Mastering V-Ray finale. Now, just before I get on to lighting this guy in HDR Light Studio, I want to make it known once again that my brother Kieran has organized an exclusive deal with Lightmap to offer you a student version of the software for $25. So there's really no excuse anymore not to jump on board and learn this crucial piece of software. Now, if you understand how a photographer lights things on a professional photo shoot, you'll realize that HDR Light Studio behaves in a very similar way to that. So even though the photographer might be the one behind the lens clicking the shoot button, most of the work on a photo shoot is done by the assistants who are actually moving the physical lights in the scene into locations that reflect aesthetically over the surface itself. The photographer's job is to be able to direct those assistants to make sure that the lighting is done in the best way physically possible. Now, the way V-Ray used to work is you'd kind of move a light and then hit render. So HDR Light Studio filled that gap by allowing real-time adjustments, and even though the real-time adjustments weren't on a final render, they were done on the black and white, glossy reflective surface. It was fast enough for guys who understood the professional workflow to get a feel for where the reflections were working, and then when they went and rendered the final job on the production renderer like V-Ray, they could go in and tweak some settings or tweak the materials to look a little bit better. To get started lighting Iron Man inside of HDR Light Studio, we first need to connect the two together. So once you've installed the software, go up to Customize User Interface. Inside the Category tab, just go down, you'll see at the very bottom of that, there's HDR Light Studio 5 connection. Within that, all I've done is simply assign the hotkey of F6 to load the connector up. So now when I hit F6, it'll bring up the HDR Light Studio 5 connection, which is very similar to version 4, except this time there's just a couple of extra little features which aren't really required unless you're doing something more specific. So from here, I'm going to hit start on the connection, and that's going to load HDR Light Studio 5 Live up. Now it's just loaded that on my secondary screen. Now one of the hardest parts about recording a lesson like this is being able to show you everything on the one screen. So there might be times where I decide to move this window over to the right, or move the V-Ray RT window off to the left. So now you can see by default we've got the teapot loaded up, but we don't actually have our Iron Man model itself. And right now I'm using a V-Ray cam, and that can cause a couple of problems while you're working in HDR Light Studio 5 in terms of being able to export it correctly. So 99% of the time it should be fine, but as usual, whenever I record something, something goes wrong, and the last time I tried to export this scene with a V-Ray camera, things went totally out of whack. So what I'm going to do to fix that, and in case you encounter the same issue, is I'm going to go into the V-Ray camera, I'm going to go straight from the view, and I'm going to delete that V-Ray camera. Now I'm going to go to the Create tab. Down the bottom, I'm going to go to Cameras, and I'm going to go Create Camera from View. Now we've got an identical camera to the V-Ray camera that was in the scene earlier, but that's capable of being exported by this connector in case something goes wrong. So I'm just going to leave it as a temporary file, and I'm going to hit export scene. Now you'll see that 3ds Max does everything by itself, and it's going to export the model to HDR Light Studio and load it up here. So now you've got the model, everything's the exact same as in our 3ds Max frame buffer, but the last thing I want to do is I want to load up the V-Ray RT window. Now just before I do that, please remember, like I was saying earlier when we were testing, I've got two different HDRs in the scene visible. So one you can see here is labeled HDR Light Studio, and for that I've enabled that while this connector's up because it's automatically going to hook to the light that's turned on at the time you've got this up. The other light I've just turned off is what we were working with to create the material shaders, and that's labeled V-Ray HDR. So I'm going to go back to the production window here. Down the bottom, I'm just swapping to active shade. Now you can see in V-Ray RT, I've left things at their default, except I've swapped the engine type to CUDA, so it works best with my two GTX Titan video cards. In the Commons tab, I've just made the width and height a lot smaller because as I'm previewing, most of the work I'm going to be doing is inside of HDR Light Studio itself, and every so often I'm just making sure that the intensity of the lights is working better in V-Ray RT. The reason for that is because the connector isn't perfectly real time. So when I move a light in V-Ray in HDR Light Studio, I'm not seeing a perfectly timed update in V-Ray RT, whereas every time I make an update in HDR Light Studio, it is perfectly real time, and I'll just demonstrate that. I can click and it's literally just showing up as I click. It makes things a lot easier to work with that way. So at the moment it's just loading up the model into V-Ray RT. And now once again, just like the last lesson, you can see we've got some real-time feedback. But if you watch closely, the update time is a little bit slower. So I've updated it straight away on HDR Light Studio, and now here it's a little bit behind. Now I've just made HDR Light Studio full screen, so you've got a better idea of how the new user interface is actually laid out in this version. The first thing you're going to realize is that HDR Light Studio 5 isn't locked to that preset resolution that was kind of hard-coded into version 4. So now I can close the window, make it full screen, I can drag out different render views into its own tabs, and it makes things so much more modular and easier to adjust for your own specific workflow. If you're not using certain features, you can just simply get rid of them. But for the sake of simplifying this lesson, I'm going to keep things pretty much at their default, and when I explain things, you'll notice that it's very similar to what I was teaching in the Coke can lesson, except this time we're just going to be utilizing more lights in the scene, and that's what's going to be complicating things. So the first thing to explain is on the left here, you've got your creation tab. And just to show you how similar it is now, I'm going to create a circular light, and you'll notice as I'm clicking here, nothing's really happening. So what can be confusing is knowing what tool you're actually on inside of the render view itself. So up the left here, if you want to be able to paint the light by clicking on the surface, you'll have to make sure you hovered over the position nodes. So now I can click, and I've got the same functionalities in HDR Light Studio 4. On the right here are the light properties, and you can see I can adjust the width and height of the light. I can adjust the brightness of the light, as well as the opacity. I can rotate the light if it's longer than it is high. Now one of the other things that's kind of a bit hidden here is next to the light properties, you've got the render settings itself. So from here, I can adjust the diffuse value of the lighting. I can adjust the reflectivity, and I can also adjust the Fresnel factor, which is another massive kind of boost in terms of this tool's usability. In the previous version, the materials didn't have Fresnel. So when you tried to use this HDR Light Studio view to light things and brought them into V-Ray, we had to render materials without Fresnel to get the exact same match. Whereas now we can roughly kind of adjust things to work the same way. So now that I've got both windows side by side and they're both updating in real time, the first thing I want to do is go into the render settings tab, go into the background option, and just make this a solid color. Now I'm going to make this black because at the moment I'm assuming the V-Ray render is going to be on a solid background. If anyone's going to go in and add anything different to that, it'll be Milton at the end. But for now, I want to make sure that both of these are as similar as possible. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the appearance option and I'm going to drag this down to 0. Now I'm leaving the default gradient background on for now simply because it gives me a little bit of shape visible over the surface so I can begin lighting the character knowing where different lights are going to be sitting on the mesh itself. If I turn that off and start to try and light things, it's hard for me to tell the type of shape of the surface itself. So just after pausing the video, I've quickly gone in and adjusted the V-Ray frame buffer and the HDR Light Studio window to be roughly the same scale so that as I'm making adjustments inside of HDR Light Studio, I've got a very quick and rough idea of what's happening in V-Ray itself. So as you'll know, in the previous lesson, I explained the importance of being able to adjust the curves on the lights you create in HDR Light Studio. So when I go in, once again, you can see I've created it, but I've been busy adjusting the zoom. So I'm going to go back to the painting tool. Now I can adjust and kind of paint where I want the light to go. But by default, I wasn't really happy with the spread on the lights in the previous lesson. So what I did to fix that is I went in and made the curve of the light non-linear and turned it into a Bezier curve. And drag things down like so while creating a small hot light. The problem with doing this is adjusting the light to look like this is done so that on a surface that's really glossy, you're faking the spread of light. Whereas what we have on the left here with the V-Ray material is a double layered material with a blurry base coat and a kind of blurry top coat as well. So the material itself is already doing the blurring for us. And I need to be very careful about how I go about positioning the lights. If I go back to Photoshop, you can see on the left here, the lights they've used are actually very simple spotlights, and just the material itself is creating that nice soft blur. So you can see also the intensity of the light's a little bit wrong here. So I'm going to quickly delete this light and start afresh with a new circular light. And the very first thing I do whenever positioning a light in HDR Light Studio is just start experimenting with, it catching different highlights on the surface. If the brightness isn't high enough, I'll go in and adjust that. And I'm going to try and get the brightness roughly matching to what's visible in the Photoshop file. So I'm quickly dragging this over to the left. So now I've got that constantly up as reference while working in V-Ray, and I'm just going to try and adjust the intensity of this light to match what's going on in my reference. And then from there, I can go on and start trying to figure out how to position the lights so that they're a bit more aesthetically pleasing. You'll notice in this reference image I've got up here, one of the problems is the lights are kind of randomly scattered. This light coming over the chest isn't very pleasing because there's no symmetry or any real care placed in where the light goes. I'm going to try and fix that in HDR Light Studio by doing things a little bit more like you'd expect to see on a game art cover, where you're bringing out all the shapes of the surface. Another subtle thing to look out for is if I once again bring the reference back over and zoom in on the two different lights used in this scene the photographer's worked with, is he's used lights with different colors, and you can see how that affects the color of the material itself. So on the left we have a more orangey light, and on the right here we have a more blue light. And I'm going to experiment with that inside of this scene, but starting out it's probably best to stick to one or the other. And because the orange material is what's been predominantly used in this reference, I'm going to stick with orange, and if I need to bring out any cooler highlights, I'll potentially change some of the lighting at the end to accommodate that. What I like to do sometimes on a mesh that's a little bit more complicated but still simple in terms of the way the curves are structured is go into Photoshop and quickly paint out the areas of the mesh I want to highlight, so I've got a kind of basic understanding of the areas to leave alone as well as the areas to focus on. So I brought up a new piece of reference on the left here that I've found, which also has the shoulder straps kind of packed on top, because you can see in our Sideshow Toys reference they aren't visible here. So I'm going to create a new layer, and the first thing I'm going to try and highlight on this mesh that the Sideshow Toys doesn't capture is the highlight running around the center of the arc reactor. So inside of HDR Light Studio, I'm going to try and focus on this area, and I'm going to try and create the highlights from that following up around the shoulder on both sides. Now on top of that we've got the inside of the shoulder as well, and because the head's occluding that, we might not get some reflections in here, but I am going to try and bring out the back of the shoulder as well. I'm also going to try and bring out the back of the opposite shoulder. We've got the areas where the shoulder packs strap on, so I'm just going to create a new color here. And I'm going to try and focus on getting some highlights pinging across here. And now you'll notice I haven't really put any focus on the head. And the reason for that is because I'm going to create two separate lighting files, one for the head and one for the chest. Now if you let me explain, inside of HDR Light Studio, inside of V-Ray, the head's facing us fully front on, and it's a lot more symmetrical. So to keep the depth on the head surface, we're going to need to make the lighting more symmetrical. As you can see in the Sideshow Toys reference, they've put the focus on creating symmetrical lighting on the head, but what happens is because the body's at an angle, all of that lighting looks terrible because it's kind of not lining up. So what a professional photographer will do is they'll break the two apart, and sometimes they might even break it up into 3 individual parts. But to keep things simple in this third lesson, I'm just going to rely on 2 different types of lighting, one for the chest and one for the head. So also included in this blue lighting pass, I might need to create some reflections near the front. Now I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to make this one green, and I'm just looking for subtle areas that I might want to bring out. One of those could be down the front side, along the front edge, and the back edge here. But at this point, I could be starting to overlight things, and it might be more beneficial to leave the front left kind of empty and let the highlights from the back bring the character off the page itself. Also, if Milton decides he wants to add a subtle glow to the back of this, it's also going to bring the character off the front. So even though I might not light directly the edge of the front, I might still try and paint some subtle lighting over the surface itself. That can be said the same for down the bottom as well. Now that's just a very rough breakdown of what I'm going to try and achieve. So now I'll move these 2 reference images off to the left, and I'll get started in HDR Light Studio positioning some lights, trying to bring out those areas. And you know what, actually it might make things easier for me to keep this up on the screen and just zoom out so you've got a kind of basic idea of what I want. Now I am sorry that it took so long to get into the actual light creation process on the lesson, but I do feel like everything I've explained up to this point is fairly important, and it's the subtle details that can kind of be the difference between understanding how to go about doing a project like this or simply just going with your gut and hoping for the best. But I've got a pretty good idea now of what I want to do, so I'm just going to get started and I'm going to start trying to shape the lights to fit to my goal here that I've painted in the Photoshop file. The first light I'm going to try and match is to get things working around the arc reactor.